Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something today that I always find super fascinating. Emergent complexity. We've got excerpts from this book that really breaks down how these insanely complicated systems
Yeah.
can just pop up from these really basic rules and interactions. It's pretty wild.
It really is. One of the things that I found most interesting about the book was this idea that emergent complexity can kind of look like it's breaking the rules.
Oh, right.
Right? It looks like determinism is breaking down, almost like there's a hint of free will in there.
Yeah.
But when you really start digging deeper, you realize even the most intricate systems, you can explain them with totally predictable processes.
It's like tricking you at first glance.
Yeah.
Right? So to make this whole thing a bit easier to grasp, the book uses this really clever analogy, and I love this. Imagine just basic bricks, nothing fancy about them at all, and they just spontaneously assemble themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Into the Palace of Versailles.
Exactly. It's such a great way to just visualize how you can get this extraordinary complexity from these seemingly very simple pieces and interactions.
All right, so let's break down some of these key characteristics of emergent complexity as they're laid out in the book. First up, we've got these simple, identical elements. These are like the quote-unquote bricks of our system.
Yeah, and what's important here is that each one of those bricks, each one of those elements only has this very limited set of actions or behaviors. But when you've got huge numbers of them all interacting,
yeah, that's when things get really interesting.
that's when the magic happens.
Okay, so the book explains that the interactions between these elements are governed by just a small set of rules. Often these rules are based on what's happening just right around them in their immediate surroundings.
Yeah, like these local guidelines shaping the bigger picture.
Exactly. And from these really humble beginnings, we get something remarkable, right? The book says that the resulting complex system has properties that you could never, ever predict just by studying the individual parts.
Like water. You can't predict the wetness of water just from looking at a single H2O molecule.
Right. You can't. So the whole becomes so much greater
Absolutely.
than the sum of its parts.
It really does.
Yeah, the book also points out that these emergent properties we're talking about, they're not fragile, right?
No, they're not.
They're robust. They're resilient.
Right.
And they can stay stable over time, even if some of the individual components change.
Think about a waterfall, right? All of those individual water molecules are constantly changing, but the waterfall itself, that stays consistent. It keeps its form. And the book really drives this point home that even though the rules themselves are deterministic, the final form of the system can be incredibly unpredictable.
So we've got this potential for just crazy complexity, but it's all rooted in this predictability, right? So, but how does this actually play out in the real world? Well, the book dives into some really cool examples of emergent complexity in action, starting with honeybees, nature's masterminds. You know, when I think about bee colonies, I always think about social media algorithms.
Oh, interesting.
You know what I mean? Each
Yeah.
user is kind of like this little scout bee sharing their preferences, and then the algorithm takes all those interactions and it shapes what everyone else sees.
That's fascinating. It's like a hive mind in a way.
Yeah, it is. And it's fascinating how effective these decentralized systems can be.
It is, and honeybees are a classic example. The book explains that they use this two-step process to hone in on the best food sources. So first, you've got these scout bees. They're out exploring randomly.
Sure.
And then whatever they find, they tell everyone else about it through this waggle dance.
Right. And the length of the dance actually shows how good the food source is.
Yeah.
It's like a rating system.
Yeah.
But wouldn't this be vulnerable to misinformation? What if a scout bee completely misjudges the quality?
That's where the second step comes in. So you've got other bees, they're wandering around the hive randomly, and when they bump into a scout bee that's doing this waggle dance, they're recruited to go check it out themselves.
Right.
What's so brilliant about this is that no single bee is actually making a decision. The optimal choice, it emerges from all of those simple, localized interactions. There's a wisdom of the collective that wouldn't exist if each bee acted individually.
It's like a decentralized decision-making process.
Yeah.
So efficient.
It is.
And the book also talks about ants using similar strategies to find the best spots for new colonies.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating how the same simple rules we've been talking about can lead to these very sophisticated outcomes. In fact, the book highlights some research by Deborah Gordon showing how different parameters, like how far ants will wander or how long they'll spend checking out a potential site, those are actually adapted to different ecosystems.
Wow.
It's like they've evolved the perfect algorithm for their environment.
That is remarkable.
It is.
But it's not just ants and bees, right?
Oh.
Even slime molds, those gooey single-celled organisms, they exhibit emergent intelligence.
Oh, slime molds are fascinating. Just using simple rules based on expanding and contracting in response to food quality, they can solve mazes, find the shortest path between food sources,
Right.
even replicate the layout of the Tokyo train system.
It's amazing how much they can achieve with such, limited processing power.
Right.
It really drives home the point that complexity doesn't require a complex brain.
Absolutely.
Now, we've seen how these principles play out in these simpler organisms, insect societies, all of that. But what about something a lot more complex, like our brains? Are they just like a super advanced version of an ant colony, built on these same principles of emergence?
It seems like it. The book explains that nervous systems, from simple creatures like worms to complex ones like primates, they all seem to be tackling this problem known as the traveling salesman problem. It's all about finding the most efficient way to connect a bunch of different points.
Oh, I see.
Which is not an easy thing to do computationally.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder if our brains are secretly these math geniuses working through these complex calculations all the time.
Not quite, but we are definitely masters of emergence. The book explains that our brains are actually using simple rules to optimize the wiring of neurons, just like those slime molds navigating a maze.
So it's not about this conscious decision-making. It's more about these elegant, self-organizing principles.
Exactly.
You keep seeing that theme. But is there ever a situation where this system, falls short? Are there times when a more centralized approach might be more effective?
That's a fascinating question, and probably one worth exploring further. But let's stick with the brain for now. The book dives into how the developing cortex, the outermost layer of our brain, responsible for all those higher-level functions.
Right.
It actually relies on a process that's strikingly similar to those ant colonies we were talking about, selecting a new home.
I can already see the parallels here.
Right. So in the brain, it involves these cells called radial glia, and they act like scaffolds, guiding the migration of neurons as they develop, and forming these structures called mini-columns through a process of quality-dependent recruitment and signaling. It's a perfect example of how these simple, localized interactions lead to this incredibly intricate and organized structure.
That is truly remarkable.
It is.
It makes you wonder, if emerging complexity is shaping our very brains, what other secrets does it hold? We're just scratching the surface here, right?
Absolutely. And the book actually addresses this head-on as it takes us into the fascinating world of fractal geometry and biological systems.
Oh, fractals. Those are always a visual treat. I'm ready to have my mind bent even further, but I think we'll save that.
Okay.
It's the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dive deeper into this world of emerging complexity. We left off with fractals, which, oh man, I love fractals.
Yeah.
They're just so visually appealing, but how do they actually, connect to biology? It seems a little bit abstract.
It might seem that way at first, but fractals are actually way more relevant to everyday life than you might think. We're talking blood vessels, neurons, trees, all sorts of stuff.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The key concept here is something called iterative bifurcation.
Okay.
Basically, picture a line splitting into two branches, then each of those branches splits again, and so on and so on. This creates this branching structure that's incredibly efficient in terms of how much space it takes up.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. Like our circulatory system. It has to reach every single cell in our body, right? And it manages to do that with this crazy network of blood vessels.
Exactly. Imagine if your genes had to specify a blueprint for every single branch in that massive network.
Oh, man.
That would be a ridiculous amount of information.
Way too much information.
Way too much. So how does nature get around this problem? You guessed it, emergence. The book explains how just a few simple genetic instructions can actually generate these crazy complex branching patterns that we see at all these different scales. It's like having this one set of rules that works whether you're zoomed in on a tiny capillary or looking at the entire circulatory system.
So instead of needing this massive detailed blueprint,
Right.
you've got these elegant little rules doing the hard work.
Exactly. The book even goes through this really cool visual model using neuronal growth to show how this works. It basically shows that if you have two layers of membrane that grow at slightly different rates, That alone can lead to this emergent bifurcation, creating those intricate dendritic branches we see in neurons.
So it's not just the instructions, it's how they interact with the physical properties of the system that creates those patterns.
It's fascinating.
That's so cool. Oh, and here's another little tidbit. Apparently, all sorts of systems like neurons, blood vessels, even our lungs, they actually use some of the same genes to generate these branching patterns.
Yeah.
So it's like nature has this toolbox of efficient solutions, and it just reuses them over and over.
It's amazing how much these mechanisms are conserved across such different systems.
It really is. But I have to ask, how do these emergent systems actually communicate? Is it all like local interactions, or is there some kind of global coordination going on behind the scenes?
That's a great question, and it brings us to this really interesting aspect of emergent complexity, the balance between local and global communication. A lot of these systems actually operate according to something called the 80-20 rule.
Oh, the 80-20 rule. I've heard of that. Isn't that like 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes?
Yeah, exactly. More formally, it's called a power law distribution.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the general idea. In this context, what it means is that the majority of the interactions that are happening in these systems are local, just happening within like a small neighborhood.
Right.
While those long distance connections, those are much rarer.
So it's like these little tight-knit communities with a few long-distance travelers connecting them.
That's a good way to think about it.
It's crazy to think that this same principle might be governing, like, how our brains are wired.
It very well could be.
But why is this structure so prevalent in biological systems? Is there like some kind of evolutionary advantage?
It seems like there is. The book gives several examples of how these power law distributions are beneficial. For example, when food is scarce, animals will tend to forage in a pattern that follows this 80-20 rule.
Yeah, makes sense. Why waste energy going super far when most of the resources are probably nearby?
Exactly. But it's not just foraging. The book talks about how dolphins actually use a similar distribution for their social interactions.
Interesting.
They balance strong bonds within their immediate family group with the need to, share information between different groups. And even the way protein networks are organized in our cells.
Oh, wow.
Follows this principle. You have these few generalist proteins acting as bridges between more specialized modules.
So it's striking this balance between being efficient, but also being adaptable.
Yeah.
You have specialized units for specific tasks. But then you have these connectors that allow for flexibility.
Exactly. And in the brain, these power law distributions, they play a key role in how it's organized and how it functions. Remember those mini columns we talked about in the developing cortex?
Yeah.
It turns out that most of the neurons within a given mini column, they mainly just interact with their immediate neighbors.
Those tight-knit communities again?
Exactly. But then you also have this small percentage of neurons that have these long-range connections, linking different regions of the brain together. So it's not about every neuron being connected to every other neuron. It's about having this carefully balanced network that optimizes both local and global communication.
So much complexity just arising from these local interactions. It's really remarkable.
That's the beauty of emergence. And the book gives even more amazing examples that really combine all of these motifs we've been discussing.
Right, give me another dose of mind-blowing emergence. What's next?
Well, there's a fascinating example from a listener who actually observed emergence at work in their own body. And then we'll wrap up with an example of emergence at its most complex brain organoids.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. So we've seen how these principles work in ant colonies and our brains and all that.
Yeah.
But what about something as simple as like our own bodies? Do those same principles apply there?
Absolutely. So this listener, they wrote in about this little experiment they did with their toenail.
Okay, so we've been talking about how these emergent properties can like lead to these optimal solutions in ant colonies and even our own brains. But you mentioned a listener wrote in with an example from their own body.
Right.
That's pretty interesting. What was it?
Well, they decided to, let's just say, modify the shape of their toenail.
Oh.
As a little personal experiment.
So what happened? Did it just grow back all weird?
You'd think so, but actually what they saw was really fascinating. Instead of just growing back distorted, their toenail actually showed this amazing ability to kind of restore its original shape.
Wait, really? How is that possible? Like, is there some microscopic blueprint guiding those toenail cells?
It's way more interesting than that. The book explains that it all boils down to these local interactions between the cells right at the edge of the growing toenail. So the top layer of a nail, it naturally starts to thicken.
Right.
And once it gets to a certain thickness, it stops growing.
So it's like a built-in feedback loop.
Exactly. The cells are like, hey, we've hit the limit, time to stop. Now, when you cut a piece of your toenail off, the only cells that are still in that, like, thickened state are the ones at the original edge. And as the new cells grow out, they bump up against that edge, that thickened edge that's not budging. And that triggers them to thicken up too, which halts further growth.
So it's like this chain reaction. Each cell is just responding to its neighbors, and somehow that guides the entire toenail back to its proper shape.
It's incredible, isn't it?
That's amazing.
Really shows the beauty of these self-regulating mechanisms. No central control, no blueprint, just these simple local interactions leading to this globally coordinated outcome.
Nature is so clever. Okay, so let's move on to that last example you mentioned, the brain organoids. Neurons in a dish, spontaneously forming mini-brains. That sounds straight out of science fiction.
It might sound like sci-fi, but it's actually a real thing. And it's a testament to just how powerful emergent complexity can be. The book talks about these experiments where scientists take a bunch of neurons and just put them in a dish. They're just floating around at first, and then they start to self-organize into these incredible structures.
So there's no scaffolding, no guidance. They're just doing their own thing.
That's right. It's all driven by the neurons themselves. They start forming connections, clustering together, and then they actually differentiate into different layers, just like you see in a real developing cortex.
Wow, so it's like watching a mini brain being built from scratch.
Pretty much. And here's the craziest part. They even exhibit brainwaves.
Brainwaves?
Yeah. Synchronized neural activity, similar to what we see in developing brains. It's amazing evidence of how these cells can self-organize.
So if a clump of neurons in a dish can do that, what are the limits of emergence? Like, is there anything it can't do?
That's the big question, isn't it? Throughout this whole deep dive, we've seen this recurring theme, right? Simple rules, local interactions, and bam, this incredible complexity emerges.
It's nature's secret formulae. Honeybee colonies, the human brain, it's all connected. It's humbling and mind-blowing all at the same time.
And if our brains, the very thing that makes us who we are products of emergent complexity, what does that say about us? About free will, about consciousness? It really challenges our understanding of, well, everything.
This has been an incredible deep dive. It's really given me a new appreciation for nature's ingenuity, and I'm definitely walking away with a lot more questions than answers.
That's the best part. It's like, who knows what other wonders of emergence are still out there waiting to be discovered.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next